Welcome. My name is Mohammad Ayatollah Tabar. I'm a fellow here at the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University. Tonight we have a very special event on Iran, a country that has puzzled outsiders for more than 37 years. Our speaker has spent more than a decade delving into the intricacies of Iranian history, society, and politics. At the time when many Iran experts and observers, and myself included, are focused on elite politics, Laura Secor studies the people, ordinary citizens pursuing ideas and ideals. In her newly released book, Children of Paradise, The Struggle for the Soul of Iran, which came out last month, she presents us a mesmerizing account of Iran's intellectual history of ideas, through the lives of thinkers, dissidents, and activists. She has written widely on Iran for the New Yorker, New York Times Magazine, and other prominent publications. A graduate of Brown University, majoring in philosophy, Laura has taught journalism at NYU and Princeton. Her book has received raving reviews in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, actually 2 reviews in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and other publications, and more are coming. We're very, very fortunate to have her here tonight with us. Please join me in welcoming Laura Secor.
Thank you so much for having me here tonight and for coming out for this event. I started traveling to Iran in the fall of 2004, and when I think back to exactly why I decided to do that, if I'm honest about it, there was a measure of perversity involved. Iran was a place that I had grown up with, knowing really from the hostage crisis. I was a child in the 1970s, and the first images of any international news event to enter my consciousness were images from the streets of Tehran, and they were frightening ones. I think now that I've met Iranians of the same generation as me, I think of us as the children of an angry divorce. We were too young to understand the events themselves, or why they had happened, or what they meant. But we absorbed the emotions of our elders, and those emotions were very powerful in those years. In this country, they consisted in large part of fear and incomprehension. So Iran, for me, for most of my life, was one of these sort of black spots on the map. It was a place you didn't go. And it was a place you didn't hear very much about. For the first 10 years after its revolution, Iran was at war with Iraq, and that was a war that was pretty egregiously neglected, in looking back on it, in the American press. And it was also undergoing political convulsions of its own that were not penetrable to the outside press. We began to really hear about Iran again in the late 90s, and this was sort of where my interest in the country came in. In 1997, Iranians elected a reformist president named Mohammad Khatami, and he came into office promising to open the country's civil society, which in practice meant enlarging the space for freedom of expression, for freedom of association, and for bringing people into the political process in a way that they had not really been before. So this process coincided with a demographic youth bulge in Iran, and suddenly in the American papers, we were reading about a country that was full of youthful striving. And it was a tremendously dynamic picture that started to emerge of this country that was undergoing a kind of Tehran spring. So for me, my interest in Iran came from 2 places. One was that it was a forbidden place, which of course made me want to know what was inside of it. And the second was that it was also a place that was clearly rich with historical ferment. And I remember reading a story back in the late 90s that added another piece to this puzzle, which was that some of the very figures who were advocating for democratic reform and who were in sort of pedestrian positions within the governing bureaucracy and really trying to use those positions in a constructive way to reform the system, some of those very figures had been the people who had taken the hostages at the American embassy. So these people who we had first known as hostage takers were now democratic reformists, people who were working within the Iranian system for a kind of future that we could hardly have imagined that they would be invested in 1979. So my background was in the journalism of ideas. What interested me was the place where politics and intellectual life intersected and where you could sort of see the stream of ideas converging with the stream of history. And when I looked at that, it seemed to me like Iran was the dream destination for a journalist like me. This was a place where clearly there had been a tremendous transformative experience between 1979 and 1997, and I wanted to know of what it consisted, who these reformists were, and what they wanted, and where they came from, and how they got to where they went. So I went to Iran with those questions a couple of times within a 6-month period, in 2004 and 2005. And what I discovered was, of course, and I'll probably be saying this about 50 times tonight, that nothing was what I thought it would be. Neither of these two pictures that I had in my mind were exactly accurate. There was indeed a reform movement that had taken root in Iran, not in 1997, but in a sense earlier. And it was by 2004, 2005, at a sort of crucial political juncture where it seemed, for all intents and purposes, to have cashed out. By 2004, 2005, when I started traveling there, President Khatami was at the end of his second term, and the young people who had invested that project with their lives, many of them who had really come rushing into this new civil society space, many of them felt disillusioned and abandoned and angry. So now I had something else that I needed to understand. And that was not only what the trajectory had been before 1997, but what had happened between 97 and 2005 to bring us President Ahmadinejad. So that was where I began. And when I came back after those trips, one thing I looked for was a book that I could read that would explain some of this to me. I wanted a simple narrative history of this reform movement, where it came from and where it had gone, what it had tried to do, and why it had seemingly failed. Was it a failure of vision? Was it never possible to reform that system from inside? Was it a failure of political acumen? Had they just not known how to go about it? Or was it something more complicated? Had it collapsed of its own weight because it was in its conception of movement of compromise, which meant that everybody was bound to be disappointed? So I looked for that book and I didn't find it. And with tremendous hubris, I set about writing it. And I have to say, yet again, that everything turned out to be more complicated than that. But that's been the nature and in many ways the pleasure of writing about Iran. This is a country that I think of as sitting astride a political and cultural fault line that runs very deep and that has tectonic plates that move beneath and send up these kind of unexpected and tremendous land formations. It's a country that is in many ways a great pleasure to visit because you will not find a place on earth that has a more complexly engaged citizenry. Writing about politics in Iran has been an education for me in many ways because of the people I've met there who have been so sort of imperishably committed to this idea of a civic culture that will permit participation, and that in spite of the fact that it hasn't really worked out that way time and time again. One of the things I should probably start out by saying is that I am a journalist. I don't come to this subject as a scholar, and so what I bring to it is something that will be rather different, and I don't come to it as a daily news reporter either, watching the ebb and flow of every day's events. I'm a magazine writer, and when I think about it, I think what this means that I have brought to this subject more than anything is a drive to tell a story. The book itself is a flagrant act of storytelling, and it owes a great deal to the scholarship of those who have really delved deep into this subject as scholars and mined the primary sources. I have spent a lot of time in that scholarship, and also I've spent a lot of time with people in and from Iran listening to the stories of their lives. It's been in listening to the stories of those lives that I've found really the sort of the inspiration and the shape of this story, because I had again and again this experience of feeling that I was listening to the stuff of kind of an epic novel. And what I hope that I've managed to convey is some of that quality of this sort of swiftly moving history in the last 37 years that has cut through the lives of individuals at crucial and common points. So the book, as I eventually conceived it, is arranged along three arcs. The first is an arc of history, and that begins before the revolution with the revolution and the impulses that released into Iranian political life. And it's the story of a country struggling to define an entirely new form of government. And it is the story of the political fortunes of the people within it, which rise and fall. One of the things that has been very interesting about watching the Islamic Republic has been its capacity to produce its own opposition over and over again. This is a system that has, on the one hand, it has some institutions of representative government through the presidency and the parliament, and it has also institutions of theocratic rule that sit on top of those and that veto the legislation that comes through the parliament and that can vet the candidates who run for public office. So this tension is built into the state in its constitution, and yet because those Republican institutions exist, you continue to have factionalization, no matter how many times or ways the elements at the top try to clamp down the space for contestation. Contestation still comes, and differentiation still happens. People still continue to strike different positions within the space that's available, and these positions continue to pull apart and to challenge the central authorities. So that's one interesting political story that repeats itself within the larger story. The second arc that I'm tracing in the book has to do with ideas. And that is one of the things that first drew me to Iran, because this is definitely a country where intellectual life matters, where the work of intellectuals has had a lasting influence on the course of events, and where the course of events has had a lasting influence on the work of the intellectuals. So I've tried to some degree, trace an intellectual history, both of the revolution and of the reform movement. And this was very exciting work for me because, as far as I knew, I hadn't read anything in sort of written for a general American audience that was able to trace that story. And one of the ways that I tried to do it was by talking to the people who were participants in these events about their own intellectual development. So there was a little bit of sleuth work involved, where I tried at times to read the things people said they read in the order they said they read them, and against the backdrop of the moment at which they read them, and try to understand what they meant. Because part of what was surprising to me was the extent to which the ideas that influenced the revolution and the reform movement were not only Iranian ideas. We think of the Iranian Revolution as having been this violent rejection of all Western influence, but I'm afraid I have to say this again, it's actually more complicated than that. So what I found is that actually much of the revolutionary literature was an impassioned and ambivalent dialogue with Western ideas, and the reform movement likewise emerged in a kind of dialogue. So a lot of this history involves the expropriation and recontextualization of ideas that came originally from the West. The revolution, as much as it was an Islamic revolution, also absorbed ideas of French existentialists and Marx and even Plato. The reform movement absorbed ideas from the tradition of Anglo-analytic philosophy and from American pragmatism. There were all kinds of routes of transmission that I would never have known were there, and one of the things that was interesting to follow was what was translated when and what it meant to people at that time. So for instance, to go back to this question of reading these works in a new context, at least for me, if Hobbes's Leviathan was translated into Farsi in 1992, I had to think about that. Why was this suddenly, and in 1992 it became something that everybody felt they had to read. Why? What did this have to do with the political events of that moment? So not to go off too far into a land of abstraction, this is still the general map of the threads I'm tracing here. One was political, one was intellectual. And then in the third place, the book tells the stories of individuals. And these individuals, some of them, they're not necessarily the most important people who walked the earth. They are, some of them, major figures in this movement. Some of them are not major figures at all. A lot of them are not. But they are people whose lives, I felt, illuminated some of illuminated the pathways through which they traveled and illuminated the politics and the history in ways that we, as outsiders, could make a connection with. So that's the overall lay of the land, but I will give you some sort of sense of what it all amounts to. So I began with the revolution and with some of the ideas of the revolution, and I'm not going to go into all of them here, but just sort of one piece of curiosity. Time and again, people who participated in revolutionary activities referred me to a children's story. I went and found this children's story. It was called The Little Black Fish by a secular leftist writer named Samad Behrangi. It was published in 1968. I went to the library. I found this story. I read it in translation. And I promptly wanted to throw the book across the room because I could make no sense of it. It didn't seem to me to be a book about a revolution. But the more time I spent on this subject, the more that story has come to mean to me, and it now actually frames my book. And it's a story that begins with a little black fish who is swimming around in a stream with its mother and doesn't seem to have any sense of a world beyond the borders of that stream. And then one day it has a notion that it's going to travel outside the stream and see what the open water is like. So the little black fish tells its mother that it's going to leave the stream. The mother says, "Don't be silly. This is the world. It begins and ends here. There's no place to go." But the fish swims on. And in the story, the fish swims on through one after another of these tributaries where everybody thinks that that is the beginning and end of the world. But the little black fish encounters obstacles, defeats predators, inspires other little fish, does many things along the way, and finds its way to the open water where, it's told, there is a school of little black fish, not of little black fish, a school of fish like itself that have quested for the open sea. And those fish have become so powerful that they can now drag the fisherman's net to the bottom of the sea together. So the little black fish is very happy now, and so it decides to take a swim along the surface of the water. And it says to itself, "A predator could find me here, but whatever happens to me, it's all right. What matters is the influence that my life has on others." And of course, at that moment, a predator does sweep up the little black fish, who dies saving the life of another fish in the heron's stomach. And that's the end of this children's story. So yes, that's surprising in itself as children's literature. But one thing, and the story is framed as a great-grandmother fish telling this story to her many great-grandchildren fish. And at the end, all of her spawn are asleep, except for one little red fish who is still dreaming about the ocean. So over time, this story has come to mean a great deal to me about this country and the impulse toward revolution and the impulse that continues to motivate the people who insist on shaping the country's future. One thing that's worth noting, symbolism that was lost on me the first time I read it, was that the fish being black, that at this time black was the symbol of the religious opposition and red the symbol of the left. This was written by a leftist writer, so you could sort of see there was the sort of self-sacrificing quality of the little black fish suggests a Shiite trope of some kind, and then you have this quest being carried on by the little red fish. Anyway, so this story was something that kind of came out of the recollections of many Iranians who participated in the revolution and suggested something about some of the impetuses behind the revolution. And one of the things I found as I traced the movement toward reform was that the revolutionary impulses themselves were very diverse, and that the impulse to sort of reduce the Iranian Revolution to its outcome, which was more or less in one way or another determined by Ayatollah Khomeini, is an unfortunate one, both inside Iran and outside of it, and that to the extent that many of the impulses behind the revolution have been either excluded or suppressed, this is part of the problem that the Iranian state faces today. And the people who I follow just to sort of return to the political frame, after the revolution, there was a rather violent period of consolidation. So by the time you get to the mid-'80s, the regime had largely consolidated power in the sense that you would no longer see secular leftists or anti-clerical Islamists in the locus of power. And the people who followed Khomeini were essentially in charge of the state and controlling its affairs. The people who would become the Reformists were but one faction of the Khomeinists at this point. They were known as the Islamic left, and they were actually, by many descriptions, favored by Khomeini. They were particularly radical. They were the people who brought us the hostage crisis. And after 1989, when Khomeini died, they lost a political battle between the forces behind Ayatollah Khamenei, who took over as supreme leader, and President Rafsanjani. So the Islamic left was forced out of power around 1989, and they start to wander in a political wilderness. And this is when we get the beginnings of the coalescence of the reform movement. Because these guys, for one thing, they're now in, or sort of in, civil society, so they experience their regime a little bit differently. For another thing, they start to gather around philosophical journals and think tanks and to rethink some of their ideas about their state or any state and about religion and the state. And this is actually a very fertile period in Iranian intellectual history. And some of it, going back and looking at it, is kind of wondrous to read because you have people who are, in a very real way, grappling with fundamental questions like, why do we have a state? What's the purpose of it? And if we're not so sure anymore that it's divinely ordained, then how do we define its boundaries? Some of them in the philosophical circle were asking even more fundamental questions than that about the role of religion and what one knows about religion and whether the kinds of edifices we build on religion are themselves religious. So this period was quietly very fertile. And it produced circles of people out of the old Islamic left who became what we now think of as the Reformists. They had a vision that was actually quite defined, that we've in some ways now forgotten when we talk about reform in Iran, that it had so much definition and form to it. And when they came to power in 1997 behind Mohammad Khatami, they included operatives and visionaries as well as politicians and journalists, and reform was something that had a place even in the seminaries. It had a place all over the elite institutions of Iran. One of the projects that really interested me that the Reformists dreamt up was there was a provision in the Constitution for holding elections to city council. This provision had been in the Constitution under the Shah as well, but nobody had ever done anything with it. There had never been direct elections to city councils. This is local government. And some of these reformist visionaries decided that this was a place to start. You hold direct elections for city councils, for little local councils, and this way you get 100,000 new faces on the political scene, people who would never otherwise have participated. And they had to look back now, there was a visionary sort of strategist named Saeed Hajarian who made this really his project. And if you look back at what he wrote now, it's sort of, it almost feels like he's trying to apply a physics experiment. He has an idea that if you do this and that, then the following will happen. And it didn't quite work out that way. But his idea was that if you hold these direct elections for city councils, then local people start to organize themselves around their own issues that they can then bring to their city councilmen. And then those city councilmen start to form alliances amongst themselves. And then it becomes a larger webbing at the national level, and this is the germ of political parties. So this is, when you think about it, this is not just a reform movement that's trying to, from the top down, open up a little space here and there. They're really talking about something at the root and branch level, building democratic institutions in a country that had actually resisted that for a long time. So this project, when Khatami is elected, he goes ahead and enacts it. And he has city council elections, probably the freest elections the country had ever had, in 1999. The Reformists swept them. And unfortunately, it didn't go so well in the city of Tehran, which they took over. Sayyid Hajarian, the visionary who had come up with this idea, was one of the city councilmen. He was also the mastermind of their sort of political strategy when they were running for the parliament. And he was shot in the face on the steps of City Hall. So he lived, but he was incapacitated for some time, and he was certainly gravely injured, and this was also an enormous injury to the whole project. Also, at the same time, the former mayor of Tehran was arrested on corruption charges. So this Tehran City Council, the first ever directly elected city council, is foundering. They see themselves without a great deal of advice, without much experience in municipal politics, running this great big city that actually is so much bigger than any city that the country had ever known before. The process of urbanization from the beginning of the 20th century to 1979 even was already quite dramatic, but after 79 it picks up all the more. And it turns out to be a difficult place to start. So I won't bore you with the details, but to make a long story short, by the end of their term in office, the city council was dysfunctional. The city had practically gone into receivership. And by the time of the next election, the voters were so disgusted that most of them stayed home. 10% voter turnout in Tehran for the next city council election. And when turnout is low in Iran, hardliners usually benefit because those are the people who believe that they have a duty to God and country to vote in every election. So the Reformists succeeded in something. Those elections brought into the city councils, the second elections, brought in some totally new faces into politics. They were, however, hardline conservative faces. And they selected as the mayor of Tehran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who might not have been known to the Iranian political scene were it not for this mechanism that the Reformists had developed to bring new faces into Iranian politics. So that was a sad story. And in fact, the Khatami years had more of those than not. Here again, I will say, I started to research the Khatami period of my book, which is part 3 of the book, thinking that there would be some years of mounting hopes, where you would have people investing in things looking very positive and the space opening up and all of these positive things happening. And then there would be the resistance and the backlash and the disappointment. Again, it didn't work out that way. It turns out, and one thing I really hadn't known before delving into this in depth, that the resistance the Reformists encountered was immediate and intense. It was pretty much from the moment that Khatami took office that almost everything he attempted ran up against the ferocious opposition of a hardline security state that was located in places he couldn't dislodge. Not that he didn't try. One of the first and most dramatic incidents in 1998, a number of secular intellectuals showed up dead. They were assassinated in very obvious ways. In truth, there had been a long-running program of assassination against secular intellectuals in Iran. But these particular murders were so dramatic and so similar and so close together that they were utterly unignorable. The reformist press started a drumbeat. They really began to look for culprits and to dig into the intelligence ministry, because now you had people in the press, in the civil society space, who had once been in government when they were with the Islamic left, and maybe who knew a thing or two about where some bodies were buried in the intelligence establishment. The press is starting to cover these things. Newspapers were shut down very quickly, and journalists prosecuted. But one thing that Khatami was able to achieve that was probably his crowning achievement was that he had a commission investigate the intelligence ministry, and he actually purged it of its most violent elements. This is something that Iranian friends like to tell me how unprecedented this is in any autocratic regime, that you would have a presidential administration saying, our intelligence ministry is killing dissidents. So that the Khatami administration was able to do this and was able to do some house cleaning and get those people out was a huge victory. However, the people that were purged out of the intelligence ministry at that time relocated, because there was still a hardline judiciary that was not under Khatami's control. that was under more the line of the supreme leader. And those people were able to find positions within the judiciary or part of sort of shadowy networks connected to the judiciary. And part 3 of my book traces the stories of some young people who wound up caught up in that web, because you now had these competing elements of the intelligence apparatus that were rather dangerously opposed. And the parts that were connected to the old, the parts that had been purged out of the intelligence ministry before were particularly violent. So this period becomes actually you have all these young people who feel that they've been called upon by their president to go out and become journalists, become activists, get engaged, to help expand the civil society. And by expanding civil society, that term sounds so sort of anodyne to us. But part of what it means, I found very moving when I would hear this from young people. They were starting NGOs to do all kinds of things, including trying to eradicate child abuse in the provinces, or to help deal with a rat problem on a street in Tehran, or to help improve the environment, or to help resettle refugees. So these were young people who were attempting to become engaged citizens and to improve the quality of life in their country. They found that they thought they were doing this with the blessing of their president and his bureaucracy, and they found that President Khatami and those around him could not protect them. Many of them faced arrest and were badly treated in the prisons, and I have several kind of heartbreaking stories in the book about young people who were forced to issue confessions and sort of implicate people they hardly knew or didn't know or maybe knew in conspiracies that they knew were false. So by the time we get to 2004, 2005, Khatami, even in 2001, when he runs for re-election, he does so through tears. He already knows that he has a very limited range of action, and his brain trust is foundering for ways forward. They at one point held a conference to debate what they should do next. I think this is 2003 or 2004. And all of the options look like yet one more closed door. They could walk out of government, but if they do that, they really abandon the people they've encouraged to enter. If they try to hold their ground and make the conservatives throw them out, at least that has more dignity, but they still wind up out of power. If they stay in power and try to fight on things like human rights or against the worst abuses of the judiciary, maybe that has some merit to it, but they're increasingly losing the instruments that would allow them to do that. By 2005, though, it becomes a non-issue because their candidates have been disqualified from parliament in 2004, and in 2005, they lose the presidency. So this is actually where I come in, although I don't come into the book. But this is actually when I started visiting Iran and getting to know it, with the election that brought us Ahmadinejad. And that election, the Reformists lost it for all kinds of reasons. I remember at the time being somewhat unsatisfied with the popular perception that the country had simply turned to the right. I don't think that was what happened. I think, first of all, you had a voter boycott on the part of a lot of Reformists who were angry about what had happened with their last president. So there was a public call for a boycott among some of the more radical Reformists. Secondly, the Reformists ran 3 candidates, or really you could even say 3.5, because the former President Rafsanjani was running in this election too. And he was considered by some to be reformist and others not reformist enough. The reformist vote was split, and they did not make it to the second round of the election. The second round of the election was between Ahmadinejad, who no one had heard of before the first round of the election, and Rafsanjani. And believe it or not, the fact that nobody had heard of Ahmadinejad was a real benefit at that point, because Rafsanjani was widely hated. So that election, which I was there for, I remember going to some of the Ahmadinejad campaign headquarters and talking to young Basiji, young militant people, and they even told me that they voted for Khatami in the previous election. But they said he really didn't, he said he was going to bring us freedom, and he didn't bring us anything that meant anything to me. And so they went with the guy who seemed authentic and felt their economic pain. So I guess I know we probably are running short on time here, but in the fourth part of my book, which is the Ahmadinejad presidency, I chose to follow the women's movement. And one reason for that is that this sort of the reform movement, which had this, this sense of linkage from the inside of the regime to people on the streets who thought that they were being, in some sense, encouraged and served by people inside, that was over at this point, because the Ahmadinejad people certainly didn't have those kinds of links to the public, or at least not to this part of the public. And because the people who had been active as young reformists who were maybe ambitious politically, that wasn't who was going to come out under circumstances of more total closure. Under Ahmadinejad, the women's movement and the human rights movement interested me, and they were, in many ways, really a different animal from the reformists. They were more directly oppositional. They were fighting at times with the judiciary, which put them in a very difficult spot, and they often were working outside the political space. There's a woman who I follow through a lot of this part of the book named Asia Amini, who interested me for all kinds of reasons. But she was born in the north of Tehran near the Caspian. She wanted to be a poet. She came to Tehran to be a journalist. She was extremely ambitious. She sort of rose through the ranks at newspapers and became a very sort of precocious young editor at different newspapers. And at some point, she encountered a news item that changed her life. The news item was about a girl in her home province who had been executed on charges of crimes against chastity. The girl in one news item was listed as being 16, and in another as being 21. Asia didn't understand this discrepancy, so she went up there to find out what exactly had happened. And in fact, the girl was 16, and the second news item had been falsified. Asia got hold of her identity documents, and she had been raped, and then she had been paid for her silence. And this had happened repeatedly, and she was eventually charged with prostitution and convicted and executed on those grounds. This story got under Asia's skin in a way that nothing ever had, and the rest of her story, in my book at least, is this sort of quest that this touches off. She felt she'd gotten there too late, and she wanted to get involved in these cases before they proceeded this far. Iran does have a problem with juvenile execution, and this is something that a young woman like the woman in this case might be particularly vulnerable to. So Asia began her activism really against juvenile execution. It was not as a women's activist specifically, but the issues increasingly tilted in that direction. She went, the next time she heard of a young woman about to be executed for crimes against chastity, she ran to that city and actually intervened before that woman could be executed. She was someone who had been judged to have a mental age of 8, and she had also been repeatedly raped and sold into prostitution. Asia was involved in getting her seen by a new judge and getting her released, and she actually brought her to Tehran and helped take care of her for a time until she could be independent. So her story is in a way much more personal than some of the stories that I encountered from the reformists. She becomes involved in these families of people who are sentenced to execution, and then she starts taking up something even more dangerous for her, and that is stoning, because the Chief Justice of the country had declared a moratorium on stoning. Stoning is an antiquated punishment, Islamic punishment for adultery, and in Iran it was basically declared illegal. They were not supposed to issue that sentence. But she was finding that there were judges who were issuing the sentence. And she took it upon herself first to prove that these sentences had been executed. She went to these places. She collected the bloody stones. She collected firsthand witness testimony. She went and she saw the judges in the cases. And what she found was that some of these judges, in fact, there was an ambiguity in the Constitution and in the Penal Code. On the one hand, it said clearly that the law of the land was statutory law, as as passed through the legislation, and that should be the basis of the judge's judgment. All judges had to be clerics, by the way. So, on the other hand, the law said that if there was no relevant statutory law, they could appeal to Sharia law in the sense they could appeal to relevant Islamic sources and relevant fatwas. So some of these judges they were actually kind of starting an insurgency. They were saying, we don't care what the head of the judiciary says. We answer to a higher law. And this is a very hard-line position among some lower-ranking judges in the Iranian penal system. So this was something that she was uncovering in her work, and I don't want to sort of spoil the rest of her story, but she eventually, in the work that she does exposing this, she also has taken on enormous burdens from the families of the victims, and she has something of a breakdown. But she's the one whose story we follow through these sort of dark years under Ahmadinejad in this extremely confrontational space that she stakes out for herself up to 2009 and the Green Movement. So I'm just going to sort of quickly skip ahead to the Green Movement because I know we're probably running low on time. But by the end of Ahmadinejad's first term, I had been there a couple times in the middle of that term for elections that you could kind of loosely call midterm elections. He was not doing all that well from what I could tell with the population. People who had voted for him in 2005, a lot of them were disgruntled and annoyed because he'd come in on a lot of economic promises, and in fact the economy had gotten a lot worse. He was in some ways a really just floridly terrible economic manager for that country. So there were a lot of people who were angry about the direction things had gone in, and then there was also a sort of mounting repressive atmosphere. So I can't say that I was surprised that he was challenged in the election that would have greeted his second term in 2009. But I was surprised in some ways that the Reformists surged back onto the political stage. Because here you had, after Khatami, all of this disillusionment, and then 2 elections after that where Reformists weren't even permitted to run for parliament and other things. And now suddenly in 2009, you have a Reformist candidate, the former prime minister of the country from the 80s, Mir Hussein Mousavi, who really hadn't been heard from since then, but he had been sort of a standard bearer for the Islamic left back then. Coming onto the political stage, and by the time of the election itself, suddenly you see this huge wave of support for him gathering in the streets and creating a sort of carnival atmosphere. I had even some of my most sober and more conservative Iranian contacts telling me that it reminded them of 1979. So that was really, to me, I was having one of these moments of, I don't understand this country, because it really seems like everybody was so disillusioned. But suddenly all of this spirit is back, and it seemed like maybe all of that spirit had been right there under the surface all that while looking for a vehicle. Now it had one. And I think, as some of you probably know, if you followed the political events of that or followed the news from that summer, Ahmadinejad was declared the victor in that election by a landslide and under kind of suspicious circumstances when the polls had barely closed. So the reaction to this was very swift. And by suspicious circumstances, I should just sort of say they arrested just about everybody who worked for his campaign, the sort of higher level of the Reformist leadership. They arrested everybody en masse. There were raids on his campaign headquarters and his rival, the other Reformist candidate's campaign headquarters. And as you probably remember, there were waves of protests in the streets. They were put down with force. And by the summer of 2009, you had these massive televised show trials of the entire leadership of the Reform movement. We're talking about former ministers and people like Saeed Hajarian, who already had been shot, and now here he was delivering a forced confession, renouncing the ideas of Max Weber and Talcott Parsons. And you had all these people who had been significant figures within the government of Mohammad Khatami, who are now showing up to be indicted as members of a conspiracy. The conspiracy was alleged to have been fomented by the United States and by Britain and by George Soros, and I forget who else, but there were some fairly prominent Western philosophers who were also said to be involved, including Jürgen Habermas and Richard Rorty. And this theory was so sweeping and so, on the face of it, absurd, that to read the indictment now is almost a exercise in comedy, but it wasn't, because these people's lives and the future of everything that they had invested in was at stake. Many of those people are still not visible on Iran's political landscape. They still don't have the right, really, to participate in political life, and some are still in prison. Mir Hossein Mousavi is under house arrest, and so is the other reformist candidate from that election. So, today we have a pragmatist president, Hassan Rouhani, elected in 2013. I think the period in between 2009 and 2013, I was in Iran once. My sense was that it had never been as clamped down and silenced as it was during that period. This sounds like it's minor, but one thing that was amazing to me was to have regular bureaucrats making jokes about the level of repression. That was just not something that had happened before. It was gone was the whole sort of veneer of plausible deniability. But to get into sort of more of where we stand today, my book, really, the arc of it takes us to 2009, because what seemed to me necessary to do was to tell the story of the reform movement as a piece of human history, because it seemed to me that the strivings of these people and what they had attempted to do, what they had lost, what they had suffered, and what they had sacrificed was worth telling as a coherent story from beginning to end, and was too rarely regarded as such. In some ways, after Rouhani was elected, I worried that those people, the reformists, would have, in some ways, even less purchase on their own history. There was a period of time shortly after Rouhani was elected, where it was kind of fashionable to dismiss the reform movement as having been a sort of an excess of an earlier time. And now we all know that you don't push things that far. That was foolhardy. I think now there is a little bit more stock placed in the reform movement. After the more recent, there was a parliamentary election just last month that brought some reform voters and some reformist voices back into the political process in a way that that suggests that there may still be a future for some of the ideas in which those people were invested. I'm going to stop here and take questions.
Thank you. 40 minutes for Q&A, so please.
The past few elections that have been reported, the national elections, seem to have been roughly 50-50, whether it's the rural Ahmadinejad crowd and the more urban progressive crowd, but at least there's some sort of dichotomy. It seems like that's pretty well there. But then when you have, as you described, the judiciary or the Revolutionary Guards or whatever, so they can come in and trump whatever is going on, is it not reasonable for what we think is the opening that we're seeing because of the recent nuclear agreements is really not going to be much of an opening at all? It's going to take just a whole lot longer?
I think it's worth separating some of the issues there that we have. The Rouhani team came in really on a foreign policy agenda, and they have pushed and been very successful on negotiating a nuclear deal that the hardline elements of the regime really did not want. So there is that. The current coalition between, so Rouhani sort of represents a sort of pragmatic center of the political spectrum. The last election kind of showcased the coalition that he's built, which includes some people on the soft right and some of the sort of the blunter edge of the reform movement as well. So the Reformists, their agenda was always more domestic and had to do with democratization. And the Rouhani team, I don't think that's ever been exactly their agenda, but they have pushed very hard and successfully on their foreign policy agenda, and they've now acquired in Parliament a situation that I think will make it quite hard for hardliners to block them, at least there. But that said, there is another piece of the regime that sits well outside of Parliament and outside the presidency, and that is the security establishment. The question of where they actually stand on the foreign policy issues, in a way, you have to consider them to be probably divided as well. But we don't have as much transparency. And I don't know, I don't have an answer on the future of the foreign policy opening. I think it's really interesting to watch right now and to sort of see which kinds of messages you're getting from different parts of the regime about how to proceed. But my sense is that it's not going to be, it's not going to be substantially blocked, at least for now. The nuclear deal itself, I think, has gone through. But what the next steps are and whether there are going to be future issues that create factionalization and disagreement, I don't know.
I know that you, as a journalist going into the country, are flagged pretty big time, but what about getting materials in and out? What's your personal experience been, and what do you think the chances of going through, I've been there in the last year and a half, going through with your book, for instance, what that would be like trying to bring that book?
If I personally went through with my book, that might not be such a good idea. Actually, they don't let me in. I've never had my books confiscated. I've brought in English language books about Iran, and I've always wondered, do they look in my luggage at those? Do they care? I've never had anybody stop me with those. Now, maybe it would be different if they had lots of pictures of uncovered women. But if they're books about Iranian politics, I haven't had a problem.
In and out and are not on any bad list.
Yeah.
A book by you would not.
I couldn't tell you one way or the other. I can't say that I've ever had them care about my books. And I'm flagged.
I can wonder, are you afraid after you wrote and published the book? Point is, maybe some people may not like to hear what you wrote, but I know that after you wrote it, a lot of people will know. Are you still planning to go back, and how do you feel about it? Maybe some people might be waiting for you. Who knows?
Yeah, sure. No, they control that from the outset with visas. So for us journalists, we know that if you write something critical, you always risk not getting another visa to go back. And I personally have always worked in a way where I've considered every trip my last, and I write what I want when I come back and figure, okay, let's see if I get the next visa. And that started to work out so well that I got a little bit complacent. But the last time I went in 2012, this is before the book was published, I had a run-in with the Revolutionary Guard Intelligence, and after that, they have not. I wrote about that in the New Yorker, and they haven't let me back in since then. So I did try, because if they let me in, it would suggest that maybe I was cleared, but they didn't. And at this point, I think my problem is if not permanent, it's there for a while.
I do have a feel for you. Sometimes it could be a trap as well, let you in and you're gone, I mean, just be careful.
Believe me, I thought a little bit about that, because the last trip, I think the Revolutionary Guard Intelligence has now gotten kind of involved in the foreign reporting space in a way that it hadn't before. So the worry is that the right hand doesn't know what the left hand does, and that you get somebody who lets you in from the presidential administration, then you have a problem with the Revolutionary Guard. So yeah, that's real. But on the other hand, if you get a visa, it's so precious, you want to use it.
You just have to take the risk, right? For the right.
Yes.
Can you talk briefly about the role of Iranians who live outside of Iran, either by force or by choice, and the activists outside of Iran and their role in the reformist movement within Iran?
That's a good question. There are a lot of people who have been forced out really since 2007, I would say. Under Ahmadinejad, that started, and you have kind of a new Iranian community in this country that is increasingly, more recent immigrants. And after 2009, that's global. There are Iranians all over the world who were involved in the reform movement. It's been great for me because I can access them and interview them, but it's not been great for Iran. It's been a real loss. In terms of my sense is that the networks are very much alive and that they keep in good touch with people inside, and that one thing that happens with diasporas, and in the Iranian case it's in some ways dramatic, is that the longer people are out of the country, the less people inside the country think that they have to offer, because they feel like, you left in 1979 and you don't know what it's like to live here now, or even you left in 1985 and you don't know how much the regime has changed. So there's sometimes these kinds of waves of people get kind of shut out. But I think that the sort of more recent expat way, I could be wrong. I also have heard people say, those people still think that 2009 matters, and it doesn't anymore. So I don't know. My sense from people who are part of that community, though, is that they have a lot of contacts, and everybody who comes out, they have family inside if they don't have professional contacts inside. And there is, Iranians, in my experience, are big social networkers. I found even before Facebook, I would come back from Iran, I'd get these requests to join social networks I'd never heard of. And so there's a lot of that goes on, too.
Yes. Yeah, just from friends that I've heard stories about property in Iran, as the way it gets confiscated depending on your associations in politics. Is that a broad problem, or does it happen rarely?
Tell me more.
So, people, in specific cases that I know about, they might lose their house because they're not connected the right way, and so forth. How do they do that, or is that common or not common? Apparently it's not common.
I don't really know anything about that, just the sort of, at will.
Was that titles changed during the revolution, and then the current government is questioning whether all those titles existed in a particular way. And then they're using that as a mechanism to take property.
That's interesting. I didn't know about that. Yeah.
When I visited in Iran in 2009, I found in conversations a great fear among the people relating to the Iranian-Iraqi war. A really facet of, we do not want to go to war again. The devastation of that war was incredible on the Iranian psyche. I wondered if you found that feeling persistent in many of the people you talked with, and how that affects Iran today, where you have some of the Quds forces fighting in some of these other countries, Iraq particularly. If that aspect of war is a fear still on the Iranian people.
I would even extend that a little bit. One of the things I meant to mention tonight that came up for me, interviewing all these people about the stories of their lives, you kind of hit a lot of repetitions, things that stick in people's psyches across large groups of people. And one of those observations that has been unavoidable for me is that the 1980s altogether were a traumatic time for people inside Iran. It wasn't just the war. It was the revolution. It was the political violence that followed the revolution. It was the repression. And it was the Iran-Iraq war. This was a really dark and violent time, and an opaque time when people also were cut off from each other in this kind of atmosphere of darkness. And one of the things that I really came away feeling was that, first, there's very little appetite among ordinary Iranians for war or for revolution. Those are two things that have had some very bitter experiences attached to them in recent history and living memory. political violence, political upheaval of any kind is not something to be taken lightly in a country that's had that experience. And the other is that, and this doesn't go directly to your question, but that seemed to me, this is a period of history that has a kind of unresolved trauma about it that hasn't been addressed, that kind of can't be addressed in the public space in that country. And for that reason, it kind of festers. And there's some sense that, that for everybody, particularly young people who were children during that time, who kind of don't have a place to put these memories. And for all of them, there are outsized memories of something from that sort of realm of violence or things that their parents were trying to protect them from. These are sort of national memories that kind of are going to need to be excavated at some point in the future for the future of that country's well-being. Yes.
Two quick questions. One is the connection between this image and what you just said about the book. I'm trying to connect the two together, but for some reason I can't. My second comment is, do you expect to see some changes in how Iran is being presented, now that U.S. and Iran have opened up the dialogue and all the sanctions against Iran have been lifted? Because as a journalist, I'm sure you know that it has always been biased. Iran has always been portrayed as in a very biased view in mainstream media. And I wonder if you expect to see some changes.
There are kind of two spaces of coverage about Iran, right? You have on the one hand, on-the-ground reportage, people who go there and report from Iran as reporters. And then you have, on the other hand, a whole realm of punditry and lots of opinion pieces that come out every single day about the nuclear deal and Iran-U.S. relations, and people who make, a career out of making those kinds of analysis and statements. So I'm not sure which of those areas is where you find the bias to be most pronounced. In terms of on-the-ground reporting, I guess I have to speak as someone who's tried to do it. There are a lot of barriers to accurate reporting from Iran, and some of them may be internal bias on the part of reporters, and some of them are also restrictions on the movements of reporters that make it very difficult for people to do the kind of in-depth work that really needs to be done about Iran to make it a fully realized picture of an incredibly diverse and complicated place. So that's very frustrating. But I think for that reason, that the sort of improvement of relations, opening up, if that does happen, if this really is a moment where we're going to see some relaxation of tension, I think that probably will ultimately be positive for conveying more balanced, nuanced portraits of one another to our respective populations. Yeah, in the back.
I was curious, in the editorials prior to being lifted and the deal going through, there were reports that there was a lot of division between the hardliners, that they were factioning in some way. I was curious if you ran into any evidence of that and if you think it's ongoing.
Here again, I haven't been able to travel there since 2012, so I'm going to be speaking also from a distance. That did seem to be the case, that you did not have a single hardline position on that issue that you could say was monolithic. The conservatives have factionalized really quite a lot, and that's been one of the interesting things about, as I was saying at the beginning, this is a system that has a tendency to do that. But yeah, you had people who I think we once identified as hardliners who are now much closer to the Rouhani team and more pragmatic on foreign policy and who did not oppose the deal. And then you still did have a hard knot of hardliners who do. So yeah, I think you could probably safely say that there is and always will be division, even in that part of the spectrum. And I think we're still not totally sure where the leader stands, by the way. Yes.
Okay. Do you have any idea where the power of the hardliners come from? Apparently, most of the people reject them, don't want them to be in power. So, what do you think gives them this power that they have.
Well, structurally, there are parts of the government that are not under the control of the people. So you have the Supreme Leader himself, who I think could safely be considered a hardliner. And there are these sort of councils below him that have powers that can oversee other parts of the government that can be packed with hardliners. And then institutionally, the two places where you see them most powerful and most entrenched are in the judiciary and in the Revolutionary Guard. And these are both institutions that are really not susceptible to democratic control. With that said, it's not to say that there is no democratic support for hardliners. There is. They do have voters. And one of the things that I've been tracking over the years when I go, because when they let people like me in is usually for elections, I talk to people about voting. Why do they vote? Because that is not as obvious as you would think it is. And there is, on the part of a lot of conservative voters, an attitude of, I vote because it's my duty, because the leader tells me to vote, because I'm showing my support for the system. So and when you ask them sometimes to differentiate between the candidates, they don't see any differences, they don't care. The attitude is just, I vote to show my support for the system, it doesn't matter for who. And then you have people who don't vote because they don't support the system. And then you have people who actually believe that they're voting to choose among the candidates before them. And that's not the most popular position that I would find when I went out to talk to voters. So that explains some things, or maybe not, about Iranian elections. But this last election was really interesting for precisely that reason. You had people who the Reformists actually issued a list of candidates, some of whom were hardliners, and they said to voters, if you vote for everybody on this list, we can help block the worst of the hardliners. And they encouraged people to vote for everyone on the list, and people did it. So you had reformist voters, people who normally either don't vote because they don't believe in the system, or do vote because there's somebody in the race that they think deserves their vote, now voting tactically and saying, okay, I'm going to use my vote in order to block the people I don't like, even if there's nobody here I do like, and even if someone on the list I'm actually voting for I don't like. So it's kind of not exactly one-to-one with the way that we use the vote in this country. Who counts the votes? The Interior Ministry, usually, I think.
Two more questions?
Yeah.
Does the regime give any thought that it's on the wrong side of history, and would they care? And the other thing is, instead of
Wait, I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
the regime, does it know it's on the wrong side of history, and do they care at all? Instead of inching forward towards reform, are we looking at an implosion someday by the Soviet Russia in 1917, where this system just collapses on itself?
I think in answer to your first question, I think the regime sees itself as on the right side of history. So I think to that extent, the answer is no. And on the second point, the future is impossible to predict. I think for people inside of Iran, and here again, I just can't overemphasize the fact that ordinary people, as much as many of them hate the system that they live under, they have been incredibly persistent and patient about working within it. So I think, you would find that among a lot of ordinary people, the attitude is they don't want another revolution. They don't want a failed state. They're trying to use what levers they have to make what difference they can. Whether or not that ultimately proves effective or where that leads, we can't really say from here, but my sense is that the tactics, at least foreseeably, are incremental in nature.
The last question.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could comment on what you think is going to be the future path of the supreme leadership, considering the fact, the age factor, and who would the replacement be, and how is that going to play into the future politics of Iran?
This is not the first time tonight I've been asked to predict the future. And it's also a sure way to make a fool of yourself, especially regarding Iran. So I hesitate to make a prediction. I can offer, maybe just some options, some analysis, but as for the future, I don't know. One of the more hopeful things that I've been hearing from Iranians lately is that, well, maybe with the current makeup of the Assembly of Experts, we could even be looking at Rouhani himself as a candidate for the supreme leadership. In which case, maybe there could be a supreme leader who would act as a Gorbachev figure, who would actually bring in some measure of reform, who would open the way. One thing I wonder about it, though, not to be a Grinch, is whether the position itself tends toward conservatism. And in the same way that the presidency tends towards reform in some ways. Even Ahmadinejad, by the end, became kind of a problem for the supreme leader and became a sort of unorthodox figure within the establishment. I think the presidency has a habit of becoming oppositional in some way. The supreme leadership structurally seems like it might lead a person toward increasingly hardline conservative positions, given the institutional power that one is protecting in that position. So I don't know. There are also plenty of people who predict that the next supreme leader is going to be a figure much more hardline than the one even that we have now. So. Impossible to say, and also in the last Assembly of Experts election, all of a sudden now what's thrown into question is how much power the Assembly of Experts even really has to make this decision. So I'm not going to predict the future, but it certainly would be the next really major moment of transition. Yeah. Or no, sorry,
Any final question?
That Rouhani's focus was more on foreign issues. Do you see, is that a positive force in terms of their greater engagement with the Syrian issue and the relationship with Assad? Or is it something that's purely defensive against the Sunni ISIL groups?
I think in general it's positive, given the realm of the range of possibilities. I think that the Rouhani people, and I've talked to some of them, I think that one word of caution is just, I think they get described often in the Western press as moderate, which I think is a misleading term, because I think we tend to mean by that sort of in line with our own interests, which is kind of not applicable. They're pragmatists. I think they will act in the interest of their country with flexibility and rationality. I think that we couldn't ask for a better interlocutor among the Iranian elite on these issues than we have at this moment. So that's altogether positive. And yes, they will still defend their interests.
Thank you all for coming. Let's thank Laura for